Hi. So today I'd like to discuss the vital role the body plays in the creation of meaning in immersive virtual environments. But in order to do so, I'm going to take us on a short trip through modern Western philosophy. Why? Well, I could simply say that, unlike other forms of art like literature, painting, or film, the meanings that are expressed in immersive virtual environments are understood through the orientation of the body in space, rather than through visual or spoken language. However, such a statement might give you pause, or cause you to question its validity, which is why this theory of mine about the aesthetics of immersive virtual environments requires, at the very least, an explanation. And it just so happens that such an explanation takes us through the history of modern Western philosophy. So, grab a cup of tea and settle in. Hopefully, by the end of this lecture, you'll be more inclined to consider the fundamental role of the body in the creation of your own virtual environments. We start in the 1600s with French philosopher, mathematician, and scientist René Descartes. René Descartes is widely considered one of the founders of modern philosophy. His major work, Meditations on First Philosophy, was initially written in 1641. If you've ever taken a philosophy class, you have probably read some or all of this work. In this work, Descartes begins by acknowledging that much of what we can know about the world is not 100% certain. In other words, almost all knowledge that we have cannot be trusted. For many, this is a normal and everyday part of growing up. As children, we have all sorts of beliefs that as we get older and acquire more knowledge, become untenable. Think of Santa Claus, or the Tooth Fairy, or the monster under your bed. For Descartes, he took this uncertainty in what we know to an extreme. For him, if we can be fooled into believing something only to learn later that what we believed was not true, then how can we be certain of anything? For example, we've all had dreams that felt real, only to wake up and realize that we were just dreaming. But if that is the case, then how can we be sure that reality is as it seems and not just a dream? In other words, how can we be sure that we're not all living in the Matrix? And this is, of course, the plot of the film, The Matrix. So, what Descartes did was develop a method in which he would systematically apply doubt to everything he knew if he could not be 100% certain of it. In doing so, he was left with one thing, and that was doubt itself. That he himself was doubting. Descartes realized that if he was doubting, he must be thinking. And therefore, if he is thinking, he must exist, because the act of thinking requires someone to think. Thus, with the discovery of the self, with an I that thinks, certainty can be attained. So, from Descartes, we get cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes' revelation, attained through his method of systematic doubt, meant that he could not be certain of physical objects or the existence of a physical world, for those could simply be part of a dream or a hallucination, or simply part of an impossibly complex computer simulation. So in his pronouncement that I think, therefore I am, Descartes separates mental things like thoughts from physical things like bodies. This separation of the mental from the physical created a problem known in philosophy as mind-body dualism. And this problem essentially comes down to this. If we can only be sure of mental things like thoughts, but there appear to be physical things like bodies out there in the world, then how do these two things interact? How can thoughts, which are not physical, influence the physical? This problem would inform nearly all philosophy that followed. Which brings us to Edmund Husserl, a German philosopher active at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. Husserl is considered one of the founders of a branch of philosophy called phenomenology. Phenomenology is a critique of Descartes' methodic doubt. Where Descartes doubted the certitude of the world of the self, Husserl insisted that the self is always conscious of something other than itself, and that something is the world. Husserl argued that rather than get caught up in a system of doubt, what is real, what is not, philosophy needs to examine what it is like to experience the world. So, where Descartes had "I think, therefore I am," Husserl had "back to the things themselves." What he meant by this was we need to focus on the experiences we have rather than worrying about whether the world exists. In other words, Husserl was more interested in what we, as humans, bring to the table. What is it about us that makes us have the experiences that we have, instead of what is it about the world that makes us have the experiences that we have? One of Husserl's students was Martin Heidegger. Heidegger, one of the most famous German philosophers, would extend Husserl's phenomenology. Rather than simply consider what it is like to experience the world, Heidegger would ask the question, what is it like to engage with the world? For Heidegger, our subjective experience of the world was more than just mental activity. Instead of encountering the world by thinking about it, we encounter the world through skillful engagement with it. When we use a hammer or a pen, we don't theorize about the qualities of that hammer or pen. We skillfully engage the hammer to drive a nail, or skillfully engage the pen to write down our thoughts. So, for Heidegger, there were different modes of experience when we engage with the world. He called the primary mode of experience ready to hand, which meant the skillful engagement with the world. And he contrasted this mode of experience with a mode of experience he called present at hand, which meant the sort of experience one has when one thinks about the world or reflects on an object. So, when one rides a bicycle, the bicycle is ready to hand. While riding, you don't experience the bicycle as an object or consider the way that it works. Instead, your experience is centered on the street, the path, traffic, trying to avoid getting hit, trying to avoid hitting other things. However, if you get a flat tire or the chain slips and are forced to stop riding, you may begin to experience the bicycle as present at hand, and the bicycle itself becomes an object that you have to look at and consider and potentially fix. A few decades after Heidegger, a French phenomenologist by the name of Maurice Merleau-Ponty picks up on his notions of skillful engagement with the world. For Merleau-Ponty, if our skillful engagement with the world constitutes our experience of it, then we must consider what do we have to be like in order to skillfully engage with the world. And in considering this question, Merleau-Ponty comes to the conclusion that our experience of the world is grounded in the fact that we have these physical bodies. And so our skillful engagement with the world is always dictated by the limits of those bodies. So, from Descartes, we have the establishment of a self that thinks. I think, therefore I am. From Husserl, we get a self whose thoughts are subjective experiences, back to the things themselves. From Heidegger, we get a self whose subjective experiences are skillful engagements with the world. And from Merleau-Ponty, we get a self whose skillful engagements with the world are grounded in a real physical body. Which leads us back to immersive virtual environments. Our question is, what is the language of immersive virtual environments? How do we communicate meaning through immersive virtual environments? In contrast to other art forms like film that uses editing, framing, mise en scène, audio, special effects, and storytelling, what tools do we have at our disposal to generate meaningful experiences in immersive virtual environments? Well, this short trip through modern Western philosophy has hopefully given us a clue. If the body plays a central role in how we subjectively experience the world, and therefore what we can and cannot know, then we must focus our efforts on appealing to the body. One of the most effective ways we can appeal to the body is through scale. Meaningful experiences in immersive virtual environments, and real environments for that matter, often speak to us through scale. Consider a scenic viewpoint at the top of a mountain, or staring up at a starry night sky. The view that stretches out before us is expressive through its scale in relation to our bodies. Another way that we can appeal to the body is through distance. How does an enclosed space feel different from one that is wide open? How does a cramped attic feel versus a wide open field? Another consideration is lighting and color. Dark spaces have a far different feeling versus spaces that are brightly lit. Consider a dark cave or sewer versus a brightly lit atrium or art gallery, or the difference between a candlelit dining room versus an office space lit by fluorescent lights. What about the feeling of being surrounded by the lush green hues of trees and leaves inside a forest versus the sterile institutional gray walls of a hospital? What about trajectory? How might the movement of the body through space generate meaning? The trajectory of bodies through space is often employed in the architecture of churches, where the first room one usually encounters entering a church is small with a low ceiling, before opening up to the main room with soaring ceilings and a large open space. The movement from a small space to a large one has an expressive quality, one that, in the case of churches, is related to grandeur and transcendence. There are many others that you may be able to think of, and many of these are often combined, so this should not be considered an exhaustive list. The point is that in designing immersive virtual environments, you should pay close attention to how the aesthetic choices you make impact the feeling on a body as it moves through an environment. These choices form the basis of the language of immersive virtual environments and provides the means necessary for generating meaningful experiences. Thanks.